In today's episode of the Redcoat History Podcast, we follow the exploits of the invasion's northern column under Colonel Evelyn Wood. We're going to be surprised in our beds by a Zulu raid and have to battle them naked. We're going to be outfought and nearly wiped out attacking one of their strongholds, and then we're going to face the might of a huge Zulu impi as it comes charging towards our lager at Khambula. Could this finally be the end of the British invasion? Hi guys, and welcome to episode 5 of the Redcoat History Podcast. No, it's not a history of Butlins, as one of my friends once asked me. This podcast is about the history, and most importantly the personal stories of the men who made the British Army great. My name's Christian Parkinson, and for now we're focusing on a small war in South Africa where Britain, with all her industrial might, suffered a series of humbling defeats at the hands of a native army mainly armed with cowhide shields and stabbing spears. The Anglo-Zulu War of 1879. If you haven't listened to the first 4 episodes, then it's really worth doing so as we look in depth at the battles of Isandlwana and Rorke's Drift, as well as the forgotten but very important fights at Nyazane and Gungundlovu. But for now I want to crack on with the final chapter of the original invasion. I'm doing things a little bit differently today. I'm just playing with the narrative, the way of telling stories, so I hope you enjoy it, I hope you find it interesting. But let's go for it. Rain, rain and more rain. Everything was wet. Uniforms sodden, boots squelching. The men, a company-sized detachment of the 80th Regiment, are exhausted from days of constant effort trying to move a column of stuck wagons along the track to their base at Lüneburg on the Zululand border. It's back-breaking work. The narrow wagon track has become thick mud, and the Ntombe River, the final major obstacle before completing their mission, is swollen, wide and brown and flowing fast. The rain is now finally slowing, but a thick fog has obscured the small British encampment that has sprung up on both sides of the river around the spot known as Myers or Ntombe Drift. On the north side of the bank are 69 men of the 80th, as well as a civilian surgeon and a number of wagon drivers, both white and black. The officer commanding, Captain D.B. Moriarty, has formed the wagons into an inverted V-shaped laager. A poor defensive shield, as the wagons aren't close enough together, there's gaps between them. His own tent is bizarrely pitched outside the northern tip of the laager, perhaps for privacy. 2 sentries, tired and miserable, stand to nearby, but their field of view is limited by the uneven terrain and the terrible weather. On the south side of the river, the senior officer is Leftenant Harwood, accompanied by Sergeant Booth, a tough-looking NCO with a thick manly moustache and a middle parting. There's also 33 privates and some wagon drivers with them. On the horizon is the ominous black outline of the Tafelberg, a large flat-topped hill that is one of the strongholds of a local Zulu commander of Swazi origin called Mbalini. He's already proven himself to be an intelligent and wily commander who has realised the importance of raids and guerrilla-style warfare to help defeat the British. Crack! Just after 4 a.m, a single gunshot shatters the silence. Lieutenant Harwood, awake and alert on the south bank, tells Sergeant Booth to alert the men on the north side of the river. He calls across to Private George Tucker, who informs him that Captain Moriarty had instructed the men to get dressed, but for now to remain in their tents. In fact, Moriarty has done no such thing and seems to have been so unimpressed with the news of the gunshot that he promptly falls straight back to sleep. Sergeant Anthony Clark Booth has been in the army since 1864, and his instinct makes him edgy. Instead of going back to sleep, he grabs his rifle and puts on his ammunition belt before heading over to the commissariat wagon to do some work. Then suddenly, just before 5 a.m, a sentry cries out, "Guard, turn out!" Another shot's fired. As the fog begins to clear and the first light of dawn paints the horizon with a faint glow, hundreds of Zulus emerge from the grassy corrugated landscape. The soldiers on the north bank, most of them still naked and fast asleep in their tents, don't stand a chance. The Zulus fire their weapons into the tents and then throw them aside to finish the job with their assegais, storming forward with their war cry of "Usutu!" Captain Moriarty, now awake, adrenaline racing through his body, takes his pistol and shoots 3 of the enemy as he runs towards the laager. He's hit with a spear, the blood flowing freely. He continues to fight until a musket ball thuds into his chest. He knows it's the end. In his Irish accent, he sounds, "I'm done for, boys! Fire away, death or glory!" Inside the laager there's chaos. Shooting, stabbing, screaming. The cattle going crazy trying to escape the carnage. Meanwhile, on the south side of the river, Lieutenant Harwood quickly gathers together his men. "Get under the wagons, lads!" he shouts, and they begin to fire volleys across the river into the attacking Zulus. Private William Crawford, another Irishman, runs from his tent on the north side and jumps into the river to escape, a horde of Zulus following him. Booth lines up his sights and pulls the trigger on his Martini Henry. Bullseye! His shot slams into the forehead of a Zulu just as he was about to stab Crawford. Crawford, exhausted, blood-spattered and shivering, scuttles up the bank. At least 200 Zulus, now taking casualties from the men on the south bank, turn their attention to the drift and begin to cross in numbers. There are too many of them. The fight becomes close quarter, bayonet against spear. If Harwood, Booth and the others stay here, they'll quickly be outflanked, overwhelmed and killed. Harwood, seeing the danger, calls to Booth, "I'm going to Lüneburg to bring reinforcements. Lead the men to that deserted farmhouse 2 miles to the rear." He mounts his horse and rides away. Booth watches him go, shocked and angered. How could an officer leave his men in the middle of a life-or-death struggle? Booth, now supported by Corporal Burgess, gathers the survivors around them and coolly directs volleys into the enemy as they withdraw in a sort of ragged square. The Zulus desperately trying to outflank them and cut off their withdrawal. In Lüneburg, the commander, Major Tucker, is wrenched from his sleep. "Major! Major!" someone is shouting. He's up in an instant, and there at his tent door, on his knees, the picture of death, is Harwood. The camp is in the hands of the enemy. They're all slaughtered, and I've galloped in for my life," he cries before collapsing in a heap on the floor. Tucker, a tough man loved by his men, quickly gathers every mounted soldier in Lüneburg and sets off to see what's happening, followed closely behind by another 150 infantrymen of the 80th. Meanwhile, Booth has led us tremendous and exhausting textbook fighting withdrawal to an abandoned farmhouse, at which point the Zulus have finally broken off their pursuit. Tucker and the mounted men race to the river and find a terrible scene. Dead bodies litter the ground and everything of value has been plundered. It's been another British defeat. So I tried to tell that story slightly differently, but still based very closely on the sources that we have, particularly the testimony of Sergeant Booth. Let me know if you think it worked or if you prefer the more standard narrative descriptions of the battles in other episodes of this series and also later on in this episode. British casualties at Ntombe Drift were 40 soldiers confirmed dead, with another 20 missing, as well as Surgeon Cobbin and 17 of the wagoneers. Amazingly, only 25 Zulu bodies were found, though it is possible a number more were removed from the battlefield before the arrival of Tucker and his men. And so the Battle of Ntombe Drift was yet another example of the British failing to take the Zulu threat seriously. Even after Isandlwana, it was clear that some British commanders didn't appreciate the importance of properly laagering their positions or of posting sufficient pickets with a decent field of view. Captain Moriarty, while clearly brave, was also quite foolish, and if he'd done his job properly, I've no doubt that the battle may have turned out differently. Now, let's talk about Lieutenant Harwood. It's quite complicated because he was alert to the danger and then organised the defence of the men on the south bank very well. But I think all of that is undone by the fact that he then proceeded to ride away and leave his men to it. Not exactly a great example of Victorian spirit of self-sacrifice. You could understand why Sergeant Booth and the others would have been pretty pissed off. Part of me can see his perspective. He wanted to bring help and was the only person with a horse, but that's where my empathy ends. You know, he could have just got one of the other guys to take his horse. Presumably someone else in the unit there would have been capable of riding back to Lüneburg. His decision was ultimately career-ending. He was later court-martialed. Although he was found not guilty, the shame was still too much and he was forced to resign his commission. I've not been able to find out much about what happened to him after leaving the army. So if you're listening and you know, then please do message me via one of my social media accounts where I'm at Redcoat History, all one word. And before we wrap up the Battle of Ntombe Drift, there's one other man I want to talk about, and that's Sergeant Booth. If you see a picture of him, that really is a guy you want on your side when the shit gets real. I think that's what the kids say. He's a man amongst men. He kept calm in what appeared to be a hopeless situation, took command when his officer ran away, and then successfully led his men in a fighting withdrawal over rough ground pursued by hundreds of the enemy. He was rightfully awarded the Victoria Cross. His citation said, "For his gallant conduct on the 12th of March 1879 during the Zulu attack on the Ntombe River, in having, when considerably outnumbered by the enemy, rallied a few men on the south bank of the river and covered the retreat of 50 soldiers and others for a distance of 3 miles. The officer commanding 80th Regiment reports that, had it not been for the coolness displayed by this NCO, not one man would have escaped." If you visit the scene of the battlefield now, it's a lovely spot, almost completely ignored actually, and quite hard to find. When I was there, I saw locals still wading the river for a shortcut across the drift. And if, like me, and you go to visit, you may be lucky enough to meet the man who farms the area and is a distant descendant of Mbelini's extended family. If you want to see the terrain and walk across the river with me, then I've posted my video tour of the battlefield on my blog at redcoathistory.com, as well as maps and images of the battle. So that might give you a better idea of how everything went down, the geography and the dispositions of the troops. I don't know about you, but I find I need to see stuff like that to really understand a battle. Ntombe Drift was the first real blooding of the British Northern Column under Colonel Evelyn Wood, but it wasn't to be their last. Wood himself is a man whose life could be made into a film. He joined the Navy as a very young lad, fought in the Crimea, and then nearly lost an arm during the assault on Red Ann. Invalided out of the Navy, he then promptly joined the army and returned to the Crimea, where he nearly died of pneumonia and typhoid. From there, he went to India and fought during the Indian Mutiny, winning the VC in the process. He later met Garnet Wolseley, one of the most admired and influential of British officers, and accompanied him to West Africa for the Ashanti War, where he performed well and became seen as a rising star, part of Wolseley's Ashanti Ring as it became known. It was as the commanding officer of the 90th Light Infantry that he came to South Africa and was given command of the Northern Column for the invasion. So far, the column had done little beyond raid and scheme, helping to convince King Cetshwayo's brother Hamu to desert the Zulu cause and bring his followers over to the British. Quite a feat, to be fair. After Ntombe, Wood knew that something needed to be done about Mbelini and his warriors, as they could manoeuvre at will and dominate the countryside. It was time to break him and retake the initiative. When, in late March 1879, the commanding officer of the British forces, Lord Chelmsford, asked him to launch a diversion to cover his own advance towards Eshowe, Wood decided to make his move. The target he decided to attack was a stronghold on a mountain called Hlobane. It's a formidable feature, steep-sided with only a few narrow cattle trails to follow to the plateau on top, which stretches for 3 or 4 miles. A large concentration of Zulus and their cattle had gathered there and turned it into a natural fortress. They knew every inch of the terrain, whereas the British had only been able to study it through field glasses from adjacent features quite far away. On the 27th of March, Wood sent out all of his mounted men, supported by his local black auxiliaries. There was no British regular infantry to accompany them. They stayed back at the camp at Kambula. The force was split into 2 elements. Redvers Buller, a bear of a man, incredibly brave and strong, with a force of about 700 men, would lead the main assault element. The plan was for them to swing around the mountain and attack up the less steep eastern side of the mountain, while Lieutenant Colonel Russell would lead a slightly smaller force towards the western end of the plateau and block the Zulus from escaping. Hlobane, for me, is one of the most confusing and difficult battles of the Anglo-Zulu War to really understand. As you'll see, it's more like a series of engagements fought across a large area, often by small groups unaware of what was happening just meters away from them. I'll do my best to piece it together here, but if you want to see maps and videos, head on over to redcoathistory.com. I haven't visited the battlefield myself yet, but I've managed to find a couple of other videos that show the terrain from YouTube. As the men left the camp at Khambula, there was thick fog. They were mainly irregular cavalry units like the Frontier Light Horse, Border Horse, Baker's Horse and Rafts Rangers. Each man had taken 70 rounds of ammunition, a blanket and 2 days' rations of tinned meat. They were heading into hostile territory, a fact exacerbated by news received that day that a large Zulu impi had left Ulundi, the capital, and was probably heading in their direction. In many ways, it's quite staggering that given this information and not knowing where this force currently was or exactly how big it was, that Wood still went ahead with his plan. Madness. The British wanted to keep their target from the Zulu spies until the last possible moment. Buller and his men lit campfires at one location and then after dark quietly decamped to a new one closer to the mountain. In the pre-dawn mist on the morning of the 28th of March 1879, his column slowly worked its way up the mountain along a narrow path. It was hard going for the mounted men, the steep rocky terrain and thick tall grass making it very difficult for the horses. Suddenly, any chance of a surprise was lost as a heavy thunderstorm shattered the calm of the night. Its deafening crashes and bright blue forks of lightning woke the slumbering Zulus and illuminated the advancing horsemen. Rivers of rainwater washed down the path, and in the confusion the men became separated, some of the units losing their place in the advance as the Zulus began to open fire. The ascent was so steep and rocky that many of the horsemen were forced to dismount and attack uphill on foot, alongside Wood's irregulars, the locally recruited black infantry. These were fit, agile men and much more suited to the terrain. The attackers began to fall thick and fast as they advanced across the rocky plateau and up towards the summit. As the sun slowly pushed its pink light from behind the mountain, the day was already proving to be much more difficult than expected. Meanwhile, on the western side of the mountain, Russell realised early on that for his mounted men to advance up to the summit and meet Buller was a very difficult task. Instead, he focused on rustling cattle and just sent a small number of dismounted troops to climb the pass and meet up with Buller's force. At this point, despite some heavy fire on their ascent and the horrendous terrain, the attack now seemed to be going quite well and things looked under control. But what the British commanders didn't realise is that the Zulus had been expecting such an assault, and under the command of our old friend Mbelini, who had a homestead on the mountain, they knew exactly what to do. Using the caves, boulders and other natural cover, they slowly began to close in on the British force. Buller rode back along the way he'd come to check on the rearguard and oversee the burial of those who had already been killed. When he got there, he was surprised to find that the men were coming under increasingly heavy attack, as he himself later said, "On arrival, I found that the Zulus had been largely reinforced and were pressing us hard, and that, owing to the great size of the mountain and the great difficulty of the path by which we had to retire, there was every possibility of the enemy being able to assemble at one end, out of fire, and then rush upon us as we retired." Buller didn't quite realise it yet, but his men had been caught in a well-planned ambush. Their line of retreat was blocked, and the day was about to get much worse. Meanwhile, Colonel Wood and his small escort, which also included some mounted infantry of the 90th Regiment and some local Zulus, had decided to accompany the assault, but to leave his commanders to take the initiative and proceed as they saw fit, while he simply wished to observe. His little party decided to leave Colonel Russell's column and to join Buller by riding along the southern side of the mountain and then following in his trail. A recipe for disaster and one that nearly cost Wood his life. En route, they came across a unit of irregular cavalry called the Border Horse, under the command of a man called Colonel Weatherly. If you listened to episode 1, then you may recall meeting an experienced fighter from the unit called George Dennison. Anyway, these guys had been separated from Buller's column because of a misunderstanding and were now in the wrong place and trying to play catch-up. But they knew something the rest of the British force didn't. During the night, Dennison himself had gone out on patrol and discovered something shocking, something that had made him and his men very edgy. The twinkling of campfires, at first mistaken for stars, soon made him suspect that the main Zulu impi was closer than anybody realised. As he goes on to explain in his autobiography, "We went forward on foot, down the grassy slope of the mountainside towards the fires to our front. Feeling our way down the rain-sodden decline, we reached a ledge behind which the light of many fires lit the sky. The hum of numerous voices broke the silence of the night. 'Twas a weird scene we looked upon as, scarce breathing noiselessly, we advanced step by step to the edge of the krantz below. Within a few 100 yards from the edge, I touched one of my men and whispered, "Wait here, both of you." Then cautiously, feeling my way, I reached the edge and looking gently and quietly over, I saw below me groups of Zulus squatting around their fires. Though not knowing much of the Zulu tongue, I heard enough to gather that they were heading for our camp at Kambula. Denison was right. The Impi had left Ulundi on the 24th. It was a powerful force, including a large proportion of the regiments who had been successful at Isandlwana. There were over 20,000 of them, confident and excited to repeat their earlier victory. When that morning Wood came across Denison and the border horse, he dismissed their reports and immediately urged the men to follow him to join up with Buller's column. As he himself wrote, "It's impossible to describe in adequate terms the difficulty of the ascent which Colonel Buller and his men had successfully made, not without loss, however, for horses killed and wounded helped to keep us on the track, where the rocks afforded no evidence of his advance. We soon came under fire from an unseen enemy on our right. Ascending more rapidly than most of the border horse who had got off the track, with my staff and escort, I passed to the front, and with half a dozen of the border horse, when within 100 feet of the summit, came under a well-directed fire from our front and both flanks, poured in from behind huge boulders and rocks." Wood ordered the men to charge, and in his account of the following fight, essentially accuses the border horse of cowardice, saying that they hesitated to attack and lacked offensive spirit. He said that the border horse, and particularly Weatherly, deliberately refused orders and were unwilling to attack, leaving him and his small personal escort to assault the Zulus on their own. His men took casualties and his own horse was shot from under him. But in Denison's autobiography, Zulu Frontiersman, which is a cracking read, he completely refutes this. He's actually very scathing about Wood's tactical skills, despite the fact Wood went on to become a field marshal. Anyway, he says in his book, "I looked amazed at such an order, when men could only advance in baboon fashion to make progress. As I was turning to rejoin my men, Captain Campbell, who was one of Wood's escort, rushed forward, calling, 'Forward, boys!' A few minutes later, he was lifted back a lifeless corpse. The top of his skull had been blown off. My men lifted his body over the rocks with Lysons and Fowler assisting." Again, two more of Wood's escort, for which they were both awarded the VC. I think he's insinuating here that they took the credit for the work of his own men. "I know that Colonel Wood stated in his report that the border horse hesitated, hence the reason Captain Campbell rushed forward. But what I have stated is simple truth. The border horse never deserved a slur in this action, and Colonel Wood was mistaken." Wood, who seems to be having a bit of a bad day, then inexplicably ordered graves to be dug for his two dead escort, Campbell and Lloyd. Now, usually this wouldn't be a problem, but they were right under the noses of the Zulus and had no entrenching tools, so the men had to begin digging using the assegais of the Zulus in his party. Not the best tool for digging in hard, stony ground. He then sent Private Walkinshaw back under the noses of the Zulus to retrieve a Bible that was in the saddlebags of his dead horse. Amazingly, the private, with bullets thudding the ground all around him, managed to reach the dead horse, take off its saddle and return to his colonel unscathed. Incredibly brave, but also a bit pointless, in my opinion. I guess we'll never know exactly what the real truth of this affair was, but as all the officers of the border horse except Denison were killed in the battle, they do make a convenient scapegoat for Wood's poor tactical decision-making that morning, and the fact that he managed to get a number of his well-connected staff officers killed. Meanwhile, on the summit, Buller was still working out the best way off the mountain, when one of his men drew his attention to a strange black shadow across the plains in the distance. Buller immediately grasped that he was looking at the approach of a large Zulu impi coming towards Hlobane. It seemed that Denison was telling the truth after all. This changed everything. At about the same time, both Wood and Russell saw the same thing. All the commanders began sending notes and instructions to one another. But with badly phrased orders and misunderstandings about the name of specific features, confusion and chaos now became the order of the day. And to be fair, it's chaos and confusion for me trying to explain the battle all these years later, but I'm going to keep trying. A sense of the predicament faced by Buller and his men is given in his official report. Our line of retreat was most difficult, descending onto the plateau of the lower Hlobane mountain, which had earlier in the day been occupied by Colonel Russell, but which he had now left by a narrow, almost perpendicular cattle track down a krantz some 120 feet deep, with scarcely room for 3 horses abreast, by rocky steps in many cases only a few inches broad, and with jumps of 3 or 4 or even 5 feet between them. And having crossed that plateau, we then had the mountain itself, very steep, rocky and precipitous to descend. But there are only 3 ways down. The one at the east end by which we came up I considered to be closed by the advancing Zulu force, and the other one is worse than the one I adopted. In such a descent a certain amount of confusion was unavoidable, and this was increased by the Zulus crowding on our rear and flanks and commencing a heavy fire which killed a large number of the horses. I'm not a cavalry expert, but this sounds like pretty shitty terrain for a mounted man to try and traverse. Steep cliffs and narrow paths aren't conducive to an organised withdrawal in the face of a well-prepared enemy who know the ground intimately. Another man, a boy really, 16-year-old George Mossop, describes his own lucky escape. Suddenly, the ground dipped into a hollow, and scattered about were some 300 or 400 Zulus, who, sighting me, began shouting and pointing their spears, while they formed a half-moon, which covered a considerable distance, cutting me off. I think my horse realised the predicament. He was pulling hard to get away in the direction of the running Zulus, who had almost completed their formation. Cut off on all sides, it did not matter where I galloped, and I gave the horse its head. He became like a wild animal, all of his instincts urging him to break away from the enemies who surrounded him. When we were about 15 paces from the enemy, a few on our right rushed in to support those immediately in our front, leaving a narrow gap in their line. Like a hare with a pack of dogs behind it, the horse swerved and darted into the breach. Some men fell over the edge of the steep cliffs and died. Others were dragged from their horses and eviscerated by the Zulus. A few, terrified of the same fate, turned the weapons on themselves and took their own lives. George Mossop himself witnessed such a moment. After his miraculous escape from the plateau, the teenager bumped into a friend at the Devil's Pass. He takes up the story. "Do you think there's any chance of pushing through?" I asked him. I was obliged to shout to make myself heard as the din was terrific. "Not a hope," he replied. Not sure why that accent, but anyway, let's go with it. "Not a hope." And placing the muzzle of the carbine in his mouth, he pulled the trigger. A lot of brains and other stuff splashed on my neck. It was the last straw. I gave one yell, let go of the bridle of my pony, and bounded down the pass. My only thought was to get away from all of these horrors. Our old friend George Dennison and his unit were also in real trouble. Their commanding officer, Colonel Weatherly, had brought his crippled teenage son Rupert with him to the battle, and both were now about to pay the ultimate price. Colonel Weatherly was leading his horse with a bridle rein linked in his arm. Yes, I know I keep changing the accent. While with the other hand he helped his crippled son. His drawn sword was in his left hand. He was but a short distance from us, perhaps not more than 25 or 30 paces. Others were leading their horses down the hillside, scattered about, each finding his way as best he could down the ledges and through the rocks. We were by this time not far from the foot of the mountain. I turned, leading my horse, and with 2 other men turned back to aid the colonel. My idea was to get Rupert onto my horse. We were, however, too late. The Zulus had caught them, and I saw the sword of Colonel Weatherly flash in the sunshine as he used it to protect himself and his son. The colonel was down, and Rupert, with a piercing cry, fell dead from a spear thrust onto his father's body. As a dad myself, I find that scene tragic. I mean, knowing that you couldn't protect your son, Weatherly must have died with a heavy heart. But amongst the chaos and the tragedy, there were moments of dazzling bravery. Major Knox Leet saw Lieutenant Smith of the Frontier Light Horse fall from his horse. As the Zulus dashed in for the kill, Knox Leet charged amongst them, firing his pistol and dropping a number of them. He helped Smith to climb onto the horse behind him, and the 2 managed to get away. For this deed he was awarded the Victoria Cross. Amongst the bravest men on the mountain that day was Buller himself. He was also awarded the VC for similar deeds. His citation reads, for his gallant conduct at the retreat at Hlobane, on the 28th of March 1879, in having assisted, whilst hotly pursued by Zulus, in rescuing Captain Darcy of the Frontier Light Horse, who was retiring on foot, and carrying him on his horse until he overtook the rearguard. Also for having on the same date and under the same circumstances conveyed Lieutenant C. Everett of the Frontier Light Horse, whose horse had been killed under him, to a place of safety. Later on, Colonel Buller, in the same manner, saved a trooper of the Frontier Light Horse whose horse was completely exhausted and who otherwise would have been killed by the Zulus, who were within 80 yards of him. Charlie Hewitt, a trooper in the Frontier Light Horse, recalled of Buller, "When all were down the mountain that it seemed possible to get down, and just before giving final orders to retreat, Colonel Buller spotted a crowd of all volunteers on foot racing for life, with crowds of Zulus chasing them, and all but on top of them, and he asked some of us who still had horses fit to ride to go back and give some of these poor beggars a hand to get away. So 5 of us rode back, and each man managed to pick up one of the poor chaps onto his horse behind. And with 2 of us hanging on to the stirrup straps, we managed to dash out from the crowd of Zulus who were hotly chasing us." At this point, the entire British force could easily have been wiped out by the main Zulu impi. But luckily for the British, these men were tired after a long march and didn't seem desperate to join the main battle. Instead, they focused on recapturing lost cattle. The British survivors made their way back towards the main camp at Khambula, exhausted, battered and defeated. It had been another terrible day and yet another Zulu victory. In a letter home shortly after the battle, Lieutenant Alfred Blaine of the FLH told his cousin, "No man ever fought more pluckily than the Zulus. They are brave men indeed." And let's be fair, not only were they brave, but their trap was brilliant and they executed their battle plans very well. Once again, Mbelini could take some of the credit for embarrassing the British. It's hard to say exactly what the casualties were. The official number of dead was 89 colonials, i.e. white South Africans, and 2 imperial troops. But according to the historian Ron Locke, later research has put that figure at around 130 colonials, with up to 300 more black auxiliaries killed. Dennison's unit, the Border Horse, suffered a catastrophic 77% casualties. A bad day indeed for such a relatively small force. The entire operation seems to have been badly thought out, and for this Evelyn Wood must take a large share of the blame. Not only was the terrain unfavourable and the enemy strength uncertain, but he allowed it to go ahead despite knowing there was a high chance that the main Zulu army was moving from Ulundi and could possibly arrive in the area at any time. During the battle, he then found himself drawn into a needless fight, getting the men from his escort killed. Luckily for him, he was to have a chance to make up for his mistakes very soon. As the men rode back into the camp at Khambula that afternoon and into the night, the news of their battle caused a great sensation. It was clear now that a large Zulu force would be close behind them, and another battle was about to take place. Would it be another Isandlwana? Had Hlobane broke the spirit of the British, who would now be overwhelmed and wiped out? At least there was no chance that the camp would be surprised this time. The men were ready, and a frantic night was had making last-minute adjustments and improvements to the defences. The camp at Khambula was sited on the top of a long, flat ridge that commanded the area, giving the defenders a great field of fire in almost all directions, though rocky ravines to the northeast and southwest did offer an attacker some cover and concealment. The main laager was built on the west side of the position, using 160 heavy wagons that were chained together in a sort of rough square shape. Shallow trenches were then dug around it, water was placed for the men to quench their thirst, and ammo boxes were distributed along the firing line. In the middle were the horses and the dismounted cavalry, with the 90th and the 13th regiments making up the bulk of the defenders. About 150 metres to the east of the main laager was a dominating feature that's now known as Wood's Redout. It's a knoll that had been strengthened with the addition of a ditch and rock walls. 2 artillery pieces were placed inside, as well as a company of the 90th. If you visit the battlefield today, it's hard to miss this feature. It's kind of like the main landmark in the area. It rises above everything and offers an excellent view of the entire battlefield. Between these two fortified positions were 4 7-pounder artillery pieces, deliberately not dug in so that they could be easily manoeuvred depending on the requirements and the direction of the Zulu attack. Then slightly behind the redoubt, which is also sometimes called the fort, was the cattle laager, constructed on the edge of the steep slope on the south side of the British position. There were over 2,500 oxen in here. I mean, you can barely imagine the noise and the smell. It was surrounded by sod walls and shallow trenches, and defended by just a company and a half of the 13th. It had the worst field of fire and the least number of defenders, a potential Achilles heel of the camp. In total, Evelyn Wood could call on around 2,000 men, including the mounted survivors from Hlobane and a few hundred local black troops. The 29th of March dawned misty. A chill was in the air, tinged with excitement, and for many a wish for revenge. Colonel Wood sent out his woodcutting parties as usual, and a cavalry patrol under Commandant Ralph was dispatched to find the Zulu impi. In his autobiography, Wood describes what happened next. At 11 o'clock, Ralph reported that the Zulu army was advancing, and I sent the officers to recall the woodcutting parties and bring all the trek oxen in. The commanding officers asked if the men might not be told to hurry their dinners, but I said no, there's plenty of time. Wood was calm. He knew that soldiers fight better on a full stomach, and that the tents could be struck and the men in their place on the laager within 70 seconds of the alert being called. Not even the Zulus were that quick, to be fair. And at 1 p.m. the call to arms was sounded. The Zulu army was finally coming into view. Meals were hastily dropped or placed safely to be finished later. The 200 bell tents were immediately dropped by pulling out the centre pole, and the men grabbed their Martini Henry rifles and rushed to their assigned positions. They were greeted by an amazing and terrifying sight, a dense mass of warriors, around 20,000 of them. Most of them the confident, swaggering veterans of Isandlwana, many armed with captured Martini Henrys, as well as their distinctive cowhide shields and spears. Their military commander, Nsingwayo Kamohole was the same man who had masterminded the victory at Isandlwana. Although nearly 70 years old, he was a tough veteran and a close ally of King Etwayo. But the Zulu impi had been travelling for 6 days, and they were tired and they were hungry. They had been given specific orders by the king not to attack a fortified position, but instead to try to lure them out into the open or bypass the British camp altogether. But as they approached the camp, that strategy seemed to be forgotten through a combination of hunger and overconfidence. They felt, well, we've smashed the British before, we'll do it again. They quickly formed into their traditional horns of the beast formation, the left and right horns desperate to be the first into the battle and outdo one another, essentially looking for bragging rights. But the left horn was slowed by the more difficult terrain on the east and southern side of the position, while the right horn, consisting of the Ingobamakosi and Uve regiments, came streaming forward, a thick cloud of skirmishers followed by a dense mass of men. Wood, watching carefully, realised that the deployment of the right horn was premature. For the Zulu attack to really be successful, they needed to envelop the entire position and attack en masse. Buller, exhausted but still commanding the cavalry, suggested that he should take out his men and harass the right horn into an attack. This they then did perfectly. The cavalry rode out of the main laager to within 400 yards of the Zulus. There they dismounted and poured volleys into the enemy, causing heavy casualties and angering them into a rapid pursuit. As the mounted men fell back, the right horn followed, straight into the killing ground. There was no cover, and thanks to well-placed white-painted stone range markers, the British riflemen and artillery knew their ranges perfectly. First the artillery opened up, shrapnel shells ripping bodies apart. Then the Zulus came into range of the 90th Light Infantry inside the laager. Their well-directed volleys were assisted by enfilading fire poured into the attacking regiments from the northern face of Wood's redoubt. The Zulu taunts of "We are the boys from Isandlwana" were soon silenced by the reality of modern warfare. Their bravery just wasn't enough as they wilted under the heavy fire and were forced to halt their attack and pull back to cover. One Zulu survivor of the attack recalled afterwards that "so many were killed that the few who were not killed were lying between dead bodies, so thick were the dead. Our regiment was so anxious to distinguish itself that we disobeyed the king's orders. Had we waited properly for supports, we should have attacked the camp on 3 sides at once, and we should have taken it. Hiding behind the camp's manure heap or refuse tip, the Zulu sharpshooters pinned the defenders of the cattle laager down, and a sharp fight ensued with rifle and bayonet. Wood realised that the post was untenable and ordered the men of the 13th Regiment to withdraw. But Wood was now becoming concerned. He could see that the Zulus were gathering in large numbers in the ravine behind the camp, and he instructed the 90th to send out 2 companies to clear it. This would mean leaving the relevant safety of the laager and advancing across open ground to engage a much larger enemy force. Not for the faint-hearted. Wood takes up the story. 2 companies of the 90th Light Infantry came out at a steady double, Major Hackett leading, guided by Captain Woodgate, who knew exactly where I wished the companies to go and how far the offensive movement was to be carried out. Lieutenant Strong, who had recently joined us, ran well in front of the company, sword in hand, and the Zulus retired into the ravine. The companies, however, were fired on heavily from the refuse heaps at 350 yards range, and Major Hackett was shot through the head. Arthur Bright fell mortally wounded, and the colour sergeant of Bright's company, Allen, a clever young man not 23 years of age, who had been wounded in the first attack, and having had his arm dressed, rejoined his company as it charged, and he was killed. Hackett's men went on to pour deadly volleys into the Zulus sheltering in the ravine, but eventually, despite doing excellent work, the casualties began to mount, and the 2 companies were forced to fall back into the laager. This brave sortie cost a total of 24 British casualties. Major Hackett survived his head wound but was permanently blinded, while Lieutenant Bright bled to death that night, the surgeon not realising the extent of the damage to his leg. So sometimes I'm guilty of skimming past the human stories behind the casualty figures, so I thought it was worth taking a moment to flesh out the character of Robert Hackett, the man who led this sortie. He was an Irishman from King's County and was a regimental veteran, over 40 years of age and the manager of the officers' mess, the canteen and the sports club. He was of the old school, a man who resented a lot of the new ways of doing things, especially the Army's new obsession with exams and book learning. He complained to Colonel Wood that a man of his age and experience shouldn't have to sit exams to prove he was good enough for promotion. He was the sort of man who paid for colleagues when they couldn't afford their mess bills, and when he was taken to hospital after his wound, the poor man, not realising that he'd now gone blind, berated the staff for keeping the hospital so dark. He managed to survive the journey home and was nursed by his brother until eventually dying in 1893. Anyway, back to the battle, and while Hackett was leading his sortie, Colonel Wood was involved in his own small adventure, which he recalls in his autobiography. I was firing at the time at a leader with a red flag who was urging his comrades to come up out of the ravine and assault the laager. Private Fowler, one of my personal escort who was lying in the ditch of the fort, had asked me, "Would you kindly take a shot at that chief, sir? It's a quarter of an hour that I've been shooting at him and I cannot hit him at all." He handed me his Swinburne Henry carbine, and looking at the sight, which was set to 250 yards, I threw the rifle into my shoulder, and as I pressed it into the hollow, the barrel being very hot, I pulled the trigger before I was ready. Indeed, as I was bringing up the muzzle from the Zulu's feet. Hit in the pit of the stomach, he fell over backwards. Another leader at once took its place, cheering his comrades on. At him I was obliged to fire, unpleasantly close to the line of our officers leading the counter-attack. I saw the bullet strike some few yards over the man's shoulder, and laying the carbine next time at the Zulu's feet, the bullet struck him on the breastbone. As he reeled lifeless backward, another leader seized and waved the flag. But he knelt only, though he continued to cheer. The 4th shot struck the ground just over his shoulder, and then, thinking the carbine was oversighted, I aimed at the ground 2 yards short, and the 5th bullet struck him on the chest in the same place as his predecessor had been hit. This and the counter-attack so damped the ardour of the leaders that no further attempt was made in that direction, although several brave charges were made to the south of the cattle laager against the right flank of the redoubt. With the Zulu horns now ground down, the Chess launched a spirited attack along the length of the ridge. They came close to breaking into the main laager, as Trooper George Mossop recalls. A line of Zulus swept around the corner wagon at full speed and raced along our line, seeking an opportunity to enter. As they passed each wagon, a sheet of flame and smoke from the Martini rifles welcomed them. They tumbled and fell, but it made not the slightest difference. They did not sheer away from the wagons or abate their speed, and they still came on, an endless stream. In a few minutes the whole west wing was engaged, and it being a calm day, the smoke from the rifle fire began to bother us. We could barely distinguish the Zulus only a few feet away. Finding no opening, the Zulus turned and charged the whole line. Crash! As the shields struck the wagons, and the whole line shook. While all this was happening, the ever-resourceful Basutos of the Natal native horse, who had fought so well at Isandlwana, had now decided to stay outside of the wagon laager, and they harried the Zulus from behind, leaving them nowhere to take shelter. So basically, they'd decided not to come into the laager. They'd seen what happened to British camps at Isandlwana, and they thought they'd just harried the Zulus from outside, which they did really well. And the fight was now seeping out of the Zulus. This battle was proving to be much harder than they had expected. By now they'd realised it was not to be another Isandlwana. In fact, it was turning into a bloody, demoralising defeat for them. At around 5:30 in the afternoon, with 1,200 Zulu dead littering the battlefield, the impi finally began to retire, the survivors turning their backs and jogging the way they'd come. The British cheered. For the first time, the much-feared enemy, the men who'd beaten them at Isandlwana and Ntombe Drift and Hlobane, were turning tail and running in defeat. But this wasn't the end of the slaughter. It was now the time for the cavalry to have their revenge for Hlobane. They sallied out, and Commandant Schönbrücker describes what happened next. "We raced, oh no, I'm joking. We raced helter-skelter after the flying Zulus. I took the extreme right, Colonel Buller led the centre, and Colonel Russell with the mounted infantry took the left. For full 7 miles I chased 2 columns of the enemy who tried to escape over the Umfolozi River. But I was after them like the whirlwind and shooting incessantly into the thick column, which could not have been less than 5,000 men strong. They became exhausted, and shooting them down would have taken too much time. So we took the assegais from the dead men and rushed amongst the living ones, stabbing them right and left with fearful revenge for the misfortunes of the 28th. No quarter was given." He estimated that the pursuit by the cavalry killed another 1,000 exhausted Zulus. A brutal form of revenge had been exacted, and only ended with the onset of darkness. As usual, exact Zulu casualties are unknown, but it is likely that they were as high as 3,000. The defenders' losses were 19 killed and 58 wounded, of which another 10 later died of their wounds. And so the 29th of March 1879, just a day after the disastrous assault on Hlobane, became the turning point of the Anglo-Zulu War. The main Zulu impi, the proud veterans of Isandlwana, had been well and truly beaten, slaughtered and sent packing for home. It was a great relief for Evelyn Wood. His own reputation after the Hlobane debacle was in danger of being destroyed. But the victory at Kambula allowed him to sweep the earlier defeat under the carpet, blame Colonel Russell and Weatherly's border horse for any mistakes, and continue to build a fantastic career that would eventually see him attain the rank of Field Marshal. This isn't the last time we're going to meet him in the Redcoat History Podcast. Just a few days after Kambula, as you heard in episode 4, Lord Chelmsford destroyed another large Zulu force at Gungundlovu, while relieving the besieged garrison at Eshowe. A small nation like the Zulus couldn't replace such huge numbers of dead. It would be some time before they would be able to be recalled and thrown back into the fight against the British. They also suffered another serious setback when Umbelini, the man who'd led the Zulu attack at Ntombe Drift and been instrumental at Hlobane, was killed in a skirmish with the 80th Regiment close to Lüneburg on the 5th of April. His death so soon after 2 heavy defeats signalled to many Zulus that this war was now unwinnable. Meanwhile, Her Majesty's government, reeling from the embarrassing setbacks of the last few months, were now busy sending reinforcements to South Africa. Despite them not wanting war in the first place, the government now realised that for the sake of prestige they had to win. The Zulus now needed to be taught a lesson. But that is a story for another day. In fact, the second invasion and the Battle of Ulundi will be covered in next month's episode. So until then, I bid you adieu.